Good morning. Welcome as we gather in this time and in this place. Welcome as we create community with one another. Throughout the course of 2015, we've been exploring habits of the heart, and during this month of October, we're going to turn our consideration to habits of the heart that identify us as a community. And so during these October Sundays, we're going to explore the commitments in our proposed identity statement as spiritual seekers united in community who are celebrating diversity, inspiring compassion, engaging life with spiritual depth, and making a difference in the world. This morning we'll explore the first of those commitments, celebrating diversity. We welcome each of you as you take your place in this circle, creating the mosaic of who we are when we are together, creating this spiritual community in this time and in this place. So we invite you to make yourself at home, to give one another the gift of your presence as we bring ourselves into this time and into this place, dreaming of the world as we would work to make it be. A day when there would be sunshine in everyone's morning, freedom and peace and justice for all. And so we sing ourselves into that dream. We gather to encourage one another to foster healthy habits of the heart.
We come to pray, to sing, to honor, and to celebrate.
We come to lament our prejudice, our discrimination, our harsh mistreatment of one another.
We come out of holy mystery, seeking right relationship.
We come with openness and gratitude for our diversity of colors and culture, of language and custom, of faith and tradition.
We come to deepen our resolve to treasure the mosaic of difference and to deepen our commitment to dignity and equality for all.
And so we join our voices together in our intentions, in our desire to come together to join our hearts, our minds, our spirits with that intention and with that prayer. We are here to cultivate a spiritual life, to sense its potential yearnings to find its healing in community, seek its depths in wisdom, ancient and new. We come to seek ways to live fully and love deeply, to be inspired by the teachings of Jesus, which nudges us into a new consciousness. We bring our evolving understandings, our openness and our fear, our joy and sorrow. May we awaken to the wisdom that calls us to celebrate diversity and embrace our common humanity. May it be so. With those intentions on our lips and in our hearts, we are fully engaging in the experience of being here. Let's sing our way into this circle. We come into this place as we come into every experience of our lives as unique individuals. It is only us as those individuals who have the single story that we have. No one else has your story, as no one else has mine. We come into this place knowing that we tell our own stories whenever we enter into a safe place that will allow us to do it. And yet, somehow, when we light this candle together, each and every time we gather, we recognize that our different stories, our different lives, are somehow united. Not just with each other in this room, but that our lives and our stories are united with all the world, with every living being, with the earth herself. As we light this candle, let it be a symbol for us of our unity amidst all our diversity, recognizing that our sameness is a light to the world. As we sing our next song, I'll invite any kids in the room to be invited to come to Kids Spirit, and any youth to move downstairs for Youth Cafe this morning.
We don't often hear from the comedy section of the Bible, or perhaps we do more often than we know and we miss it through generations of cultural shift and decades and centuries of interpretation and traditioning. But unmistakably, the story of Jonah is a comedy. And John Shelby Spong has captured that sense of comedy in his paraphrase of the very short little book of Jonah, 4 chapters long, hidden in the Bible in what's called the minor prophets, not because they were supposedly less important, but because their books were very short. So he's squeezed between the book of Obadiah, which has just 4 chapters, and the book of Micah, which is just slightly longer. You'll find Jonah's story. And this is the way John Shelby Spong tells the story. Once upon a time, there was a prophet in Israel whose name was Jonah. Jonah was told that he was to go and preach to the people of Nineveh. Nineveh, he said, you got to be kidding. That's an unclean Gentile city. Why would I go and do something that weird? However, the message was clear and insistent, and so Jonah had to respond. And he did so in the classic way that people do when they're told by an authority figure to do something they really don't want to do. He said yes, but he meant no. So he went through all the motions of leaving. He went to his home, packed a suitcase, went down to the port, booked passage on a boat. But his ticket was to Tarshish, not to Nineveh. He thought if he got caught, he could just claim that he misunderstood. And by that time, surely his God would have had second thoughts about sending him anyway. So Jonah boarded the ship, unpacked his suitcase in his stateroom, put on his Bermuda shorts, got out a good book, put himself topside on a deck chair as the ship pulled out into the Mediterranean Sea. The trip was uneventful until a dark cloud in the sky seemed to be shadowing the boat. Aware of this dark presence, the captain tried to escape it by turning the boat first to the right and then to the left, but the cloud turned just in concert with the boat. The rest of the sky was clear and blue. The cloud got darker and darker, and from within it came flashes of lightning, the roar of thunder, and of course, finally, rain. So strange was this phenomenon that the captain drew the obvious conclusion: someone up there doesn't like someone down here. So in what he regarded as a rather scientific process, he sought to identify the culprit. He drew straws, and the lot of the short straw fell on Jonah. "What's this you've done, Jonah?" the captain asked. "Well, I was told to go and preach to the Ninevites, but I knew that God couldn't possibly care about the Ninevites, so I booked passage on this boat instead." And the captain was concerned about what he could do, thought he could ride out the storm until a bolt of lightning struck nearby and a wave from the sea swept over the boat. Jonah's deck chair from one end of the ship went to the other. That was when the captain weighed his own security against Jonah's decision and decided that Jonah had to go. So with the help of 3 deckhands, Jonah was seized by his limbs, and on the count of 3, the men hurled him overboard into the sea. But Jonah never hit the water. A great fish swam by. Everyone thought it was a whale, but the word whale never occurred in this story. This fish had been swimming in tandem with the boat, waiting for its star moment in the drama. Jonah fell into its open jaws, which closed over him, and found himself living in the belly of this great fish. But Jonah had amazingly adaptive qualities, so he settled down and started to make his new home comfortable, rearranging the furniture and hanging the curtains. For 3 days and nights, Jonah lived in this new but somewhat confining Mediterranean condominium until even the fish couldn't stand Jonah any longer. So it was with a great primeval belch the fish threw up Jonah, who tumbled head over heels into a conveniently located sandbar in the middle of the sea. As Jonah was clearing his head and taking in his new situation, he heard a voice saying, "Jonah, how do you feel now about going to preach to the people of Nineveh?" "Okay," he said with little conviction, "you win. I'll go." Jonah got to Nineveh and was still convinced it was all a big mistake. So he opted for a new form of resistance. In Frank Sinatra fashion, he concluded, "I'll do it, but I'll do it my way. I'll preach, but I'll preach by muttering under my breath, and I'll do it only in the back streets and the alleyways of the city." So Jonah went around Nineveh muttering, "Repent, turn around, find God," hoping no one would hear. But to his amazement, everyone heard. Crowds poured into the streets from every house and condominium in the city, tearing their clothes and looking for mercy. Jonah was apparently the most successful evangelist in the world. Modern televangelists would eat their hearts out for this kind of a response. But Jonah was angry. Storming out of the city, he said, "I knew this would happen. That's why I didn't want to come. Those wretched people deserve punishment." Jonah found a spot just outside the city where he sat down and sulked. The sounds of revival could be heard as sweet hour of prayer was being sung by the penitents. When Jonah woke up, a giant plant had grown up near his head. During the day, Jonah found protection from the desert sun in its foliage and sanctuary from the biting desert wind in its trunk. And that night, a worm ate the giant tree, leaving only a small pile of sawdust. When Jonah woke up, he was distressed at the loss of his beloved tree. He wept and mourned and felt a depth of bereavement. Finally, the divine voice spoke and broke the silence. "Jonah, how is it that you can have such passionate feelings and empathy for this tree, and yet you appear to have no compassion at all for 120,000 people who make their home in Nineveh, to say nothing of their cattle?" This is a paraphrase of a folk tale passed down to us from the writings of ancient Israel. Jonah is the Archie Bunker of the Bible. The guy who makes absolutely no attempt to disguise his bigotry or hide inside any manner of political correctness. And the story that gives us this character is really better known to us by its star wildlife, because if we know this story, we know it as the story of Jonah and the whale. It's actually a great folk tale that tells a remarkably subversive story. It starts out with, "as it came to pass." You notice in the Bible, it never says, "and it came to stay." It always comes to pass, just like life. That should have been our first clue that we're not hearing history, we're hearing a literary creation that might just as well have begun with, "Once upon a time, in a far-off land, there was a certain man named Jonah." He's a comical character, created by a clever storyteller. Fantastic little story to challenge the prejudices of his own people without paying for it with his life. Jonah is this buffoonish character who wears his biases so blazonly on his sleeve that the audience is caught off guard, laughing at Jonah before they realize that they are the brunt of the joke. As the tall tale goes, he hears a vision in which he believes he hears the voice of his God, sending him on a mission to a town of terrorists. At least that was the reputation of the Ninevites in Jonah's world. So Jonah is destined to be the superhero, and the Ninevites are cast in the role of the evil empire, and we all think we know how this formulaic story is going to end. Jonah is, in the beginning, divinely commissioned to go to Nineveh and confront the enemy. Nineveh was the capital of ancient Assyria, which had taken Jonah's people hostage, captive, in the 8th century, about 200 years before this story was being told. They viewed the Assyrians as the other, the them, the enemy to the north, the evil empire characterized by corruption and violence. At least that's what Foxy News and their religious community had been telling them. So Jonah followed his first instinct and he sails for Spain. Now that's due west on the Mediterranean, definitely not northeast towards Nineveh. Is he directionally challenged or directionally defiant? Well, as the story goes, the runaway becomes a stowaway, and then there's a great storm on the sea. He's below deck sleeping while the sailors are doing everything in their power to survive and save the ship. They're praying to their gods, and they're praying with their hands and with their feet. They're calling upon their gods to help, and they're working their butts off, throwing the cargo overboard, trying to lighten the ship. The only guy who is neither calling on his God to intervene nor doing anything to lend a hand naturally becomes the prime suspect. The storm has neither moved him to pray nor to lift a finger to help, because he would rather be buried at sea than be caught alive in Nineveh. So he invites the sailors to throw him overboard, believing that this will appease the God that he has so displeased and allow the others to escape his fate. But in the world of the story, this rough and tough crew of mariners, this multi-faith mix of humanity, this cast of characters that Jonah would have known in his world to be criminals, whom he would have called infidels and pagans because they didn't worship his God. They do everything in their power to avoid throwing him overboard. They work as hard to save this outsider as they do to save their own skin. But in the end, they reluctantly concede that they have no alternative but to sacrifice him to the sea as he has suggested. And in the world of tribal stories, the sea god is appeased, and the sailors and the ship are spared, and Jonah's salvation comes swimming by. It must have been a not-so-tight-lipped tuna who provided hospitality and transportation for 3 days and 3 long nights before letting out the biggest belch in the Bible and upchucking Jonah onto a Mediterranean beach, leaving him to walk to Nineveh. The earliest audiences who heard this story know their Middle Eastern geography really well. They know that waking up on a beach in the Mediterranean to walk to Nineveh is like waking up on a beach near Tolfino when you're going to Vegreville. They would see the humor in this fictitious story. And the next thing you know, in the time of story, Jonah has arrived in Nineveh. The place the storyteller exaggerates for his listener's imagination, imagining a huge city that takes 3 days to walk from one end to the other. But Jonah is so anxious to get his job done and to get out of there that he starts his little spiel in the suburbs on the outskirts of town. And he's arrogant and moody, and he couldn't care less about his audience. All that time he had to prepare a sermon, and he doesn't give it a moment's thought. He just mutters the world's shortest and most insincere sermon. Doesn't even bother to warm his listeners up in any way. Doesn't tell them any stories. Try to have them identify with him. And people can't fall to their knees fast enough. As the story goes, even the cattle had a change of heart. And to top it all off, it was the king of Assyria who led the way. After his brief evangelistic career, Jonah's in a major funk. Because Jonah preferred the theology that was dominating 6th century Israel before the Common Era, those to whom this story was being told. He preferred that theology that was the order of the day, that you get an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You deserve what you get, and you get what you deserve. What goes around comes around. Those were the good old days when you could count on your God to vindicate the righteous and slay the wicked. In other words, Jonah represented the conventional wisdom of his day, hook, line, and sinker. That fear-filled rhetoric about foreigners that was sweeping through post-exilic Israel and had led to a period of ethnic cleansing. Jonah embodied their beliefs and their prejudices. He, like his people, those to whom this story was addressed, they assumed that their God hated the Ninevites every bit as much as they did, and surely wouldn't waste any good compassion on them. Those for whom this story was devised assumed that the destruction of their temple and their exile in Babylon had been their God's judgment on them for allowing themselves to be corrupted by alien influences. Some of their ancestors had married foreigners like the Ninevites. And those who had returned from exile came to believe that these Gentiles had brought judgment on their nation and had compromised the racial purity of the chosen people. So imagine this creative storyteller devising this nautical and comical story of Jonah as a kind of protest literature that undermines the dominant assumptions of a particular people at a particular point in time. Imagine you're hearing this story on the streets of Jerusalem in the 6th century, before the Common Era, when Ezra, the star prophet of the day, and his compatriots are inspiring a closed borders policy, a Jews-only city, a purity campaign to stamp out diversity, to end interracial, interfaith marriage, to end what they saw as the synchronicity of a mix of religious traditions, and to undertake a campaign that was nothing short of ethnic cleansing. So as these listeners are laughing at this right-winged runaway, stowaway, castaway, did they begin to see that Jonah was a caricature of themselves? Did they get caught in the joke like we do in every episode of All in the Family as we recognize Archie's prejudice as our own? This story challenged their assumptions about the world, about the way things are. It challenged their assumptions about that which they called God. And it challenged their assumptions about themselves and about those who were distinct and different from them in race and religion, in traditions and practices, in what they wore, and in how they expressed themselves. This story confronted them with diversity and challenged their assumptions and their beliefs. It was a subversive little story that turned their world upside down. A story really that properly belongs to the prophetic tradition of the Judeo-Christian faith because it uses comedy as a tool to bring a much-needed wisdom to our dangerous and our deadly assumptions. It's a story that confronts us with our biases and our bigotry. And the story is and was unfinished. The story doesn't tell us what Jonah will do with a God that doesn't support his prejudice. The story doesn't tell us whether Jonah will remain in exile from his highest humanity. We don't know whether Jonah will open his heart or his mind to embrace the diversity that surrounds him right there in Nineveh. We don't know what he will do with his tribal God that has just transcended his understanding. We don't know what we will do with this story or what it will do with us. Because this ancient story comes to us as a mirror to see the Jonah in ourselves, to see where we exclude, where we judge, where we fail to embrace one another, where we fail to celebrate uniqueness and difference. A few centuries after this story was told, that same land would raise a prophet in a small village of Nazareth, a prophet who would challenge the assumptions of the boundaries of race and religion, of gender and class. It would raise Jesus of Nazareth, who would break all the religious rules and the social norms, who in his storytelling would shatter assumptions about the one we know as the other, and invite those of us who follow his teaching to be radical as he was in our hospitality, and to practice exceptional acceptance. It's easy to celebrate those who think like us, those who look like us, those who love like us, those who vote like us, those who believe what we believe, those who reject what we reject. But that's not the invitation of the community of Jesus. The invitation of the community of Jesus of Nazareth is to be radical in hospitality. Not occasional, not mediocre, radical. To be celebrative of diversity. To be genuine and generous in practicing acceptance. We come to this day, a day when traditionally Christian churches across the world celebrate World Communion, where our religious tradition will gather at tables small and great. We come to this day, to this table, to this circle, to the mirror of this ancient story to examine the habits of our hearts. We come here to commit to making acceptance a habit we take up every day, until we can't find enough ways to bless the strange and wonderful diversity in every patch of earth, in each drop of water, in every leaf, in every tree, in each you and me. So this is our time to pause and hold silence with each other as we take up our practicing once again. Continuing in a spirit of prayer, we pray with one another. We gather in the light of this day with gratitude for the mystery of being, for the wonder of it all, for the circle of life. In the many circles in which our lives are lived, may we bring radical acceptance and deep compassion. Where the circle is changed by grief and loss, may we know the grace of companionship and the strength of hope, and may we be a face of love. Where the circle is strained by resentments, misunderstandings, jealousies, and anger, may we find peace in our hearts and risk wearing our hearts on our sleeves. Where the circle shrinks from inclusion because of fear or poverty, because of ignorance or judgment, because of bias or prejudice. May we know that we are never separated from love. Where the circle is broken by suffering, by disease or disaster, by acts that seem unspeakable. May we know what it is to be held in love, sustained in the trust of the essential goodness of life. Where the circle is strained by mental illness, by disease, by misunderstandings, by addictions, may we find our paths to healing. In the circle of earth, our home for this journey, may we be conscious of the generations who've gone before us and those who will come after us. May we be faithful to the systems that sustain life for all beings. Where the circle of our good intention has waned, may we awaken to weave a love that turns hostility towards friendship, competition toward cooperation, fear toward love. In the gift of this stillness, we open to the prayers that are within us. In silence, the prayers of our gratitude and the prayers of our hoping and coping. Through all the changing seasons in our hearts and in our hemisphere, through all the turnings of our lives, we pray, ever seeking more light. May it be so. Amen. At this table we gather, friends and strangers, spiritual seekers, all of us, united in community.
At this table, we celebrate the unfolding of matter, the evolution of life and spirit that has brought us each to this moment.
At this table we celebrate our common origin with everything that is.
And at this table, we acknowledge the sacred mystery that links each and every human person, aware that each one of us gives unique expression to spirit and sacredness in our world.
At this table, we celebrate that we're all connected, interrelated, and interdependent.
We remember the stories of our tradition, how the sharing of wisdom was so often accompanied by the sharing of a meal. We remember stories of Jesus sharing bread, sharing wine, sharing wisdom, sharing life. At this table, we honor the radical hospitality that Jesus inspired by resisting the social norms, biases, and prejudices that segregated his society. In remembering, may we be inspired to commit to lives of sharing and compassion and creation. And so in our commitment, we can share these words with one another. We commit to creating a world of inclusion,
where all people live with respect and dignity, where everyone present receive a share. We commit to creating a world of sufficiency, where every systems of privilege are challenged, where abundance overcomes scarcity, where wealth is shared, where we all have enough. We commit to creating a world of compassion, where hearts and hands reach for each other, where there need not be secrets in eyes, where nobody is alone. May the nourishment of these gifts of our tradition and these commitments we make each day enable us to celebrate diversity, inspire compassion, engage life with spiritual depth, and make a positive difference in the world.
We're all welcome at this table. You don't need to be a member of this church or any church to be welcome and to participate at this table. You don't have to believe point 1, 2, and 3. You don't need to be this way or that way. But if you're hungry for openness and compassion, if you're thirsty for understanding and connection, if you're confused or conflicted, if you're not sure what you're searching for, you have a place at this table. This bread and this cup is for you. You're welcome exactly as you are, invited, welcomed, accepted, to honor this time with the bread of compassion and the cup of connection, and celebrate community in this space.
Come and share the bread of compassion and the cup of community. John Philip Newell, former warden of Iona Abbey, tells the story of speaking to a community gathered in Ottawa, speaking about the opening words of John's Gospel, words about light, words about seeing light in Jesus of Nazareth, words about being light in the world. A Mohawk elder stood up and said to John Philip Newell, "If only those who had first come to this land, those Europeans who had first come to this land, had come seeking light in us, how different our histories would be. How different our present and our future will be if we go from this circle seeking light in one another, seeking light in every living being, knowing that all life is sacred, sacred in its uniqueness, sacred in its diversity. We go singing a song we've begun to learn, a piece of music that Chris composed on his sabbatical. We go with the commitment to find the sacredness, to embrace the sacredness of life."